Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June Policy Insight. I'm very pleased to have here today Brunello Rosa, CEO of Rosa and Rubini, an independent macroeconomic analysis company founded by Brunello and Nuria Rubini. And Brunello is also a visiting professor at Bocconi and lecturer at LSE, the London School of Economics. We're here today to talk about the macroeconomic case of digital currencies, because we think that it's time that the analysis of all of this new economy and new subject comes from also a macroeconomic perspective after having been so much dismissed by the sort of, established world, let's call it like this. So Brunello, why are central banks thinking to introduce CBDCs?
Good morning, everybody. Effectively, central banks had to respond to the initiatives by the private sector. We have seen in the last few years emerging various means of payments, call it electronic, call it digital, by private sector entities. In China, they are very much widespread. WeChat Pay being an example, Alipay being another. But clearly, also in the Western world, lots of other circuits have been introduced to make electronic payments. And then we see the emergence of crypto, however credible that threat could potentially be, and more recently, stable coins. And clearly, central banks cannot have the vast majority of their transactions happening outside the scope of what they can actually see. So it is good for them, from their perspective, to provide a means of payment on which they have some form of control, the same way they have control of banknotes and coins in circulation. From the perspective of the consumer, of course, having a public safe assets in their digital virtual portfolios whenever they're going to be available is considered by central banks absolutely essential to build that kind of foundation of trust on all other forms of digital payment, even those provided by the private sector. So from that perspective, this is something that is extremely useful both for the citizens and for themselves.
Thank you, Brunello. And what could be the implications for the banking system and more in general, the economy? Like we've seen that, even in the UK, reports like the House of Lords reports say that there are many open questions, or at least they say, well, find a case, convince us that there is a case. So what are the implications for the banking system, and what is good for the economy in this?
The banking system clearly seems a bit threatened by the introduction of CBDCs, a new central bank liability, especially if they were to do all the dirty work, so to speak, of the KYC, the Know Your Customer activities, the AML, the anti-money laundering, the counter-terrorism financing controls, and all the kind of activities that are considered pure costs for the banking system without having necessarily a visible benefit, which is the reason why we believe that eventually central bank digital currencies, when and if they will be introduced, they will be somehow incentive compatible, so not just for the general public, but also for the banking system that somehow needs to be brought on board with this initiative. Some Chinese studies have shown that when digital currencies are in circulation, economic activity increases in the areas where they've been experimented in the various pilots that they've conducted. And that's effectively because it's such an easy way of paying with instantaneous transactions taking place domestically, but eventually also abroad, that economic activity can benefit from the introduction of CBDCs. But more in general, I would say it seems to me an unavoidable development. We move from written letters to emails. We will need to move from paper cash to digital currencies in the new digital era.
Do you want to touch on rates, maybe?
Yeah, that's about the potential interaction with monetary policy. I mean, one of the good features of central bank digital currencies, one way of incentivizing the general public is by offering a positive interest rates on this digital currency when they sit on our wallets. That's a good thing. Banknotes don't do that. But clearly, when central banks wants to convince us to spend money, they can introduce negative interest rates on CBDCs, and so there would be a bit of a rush to use this money, which is more or less the equivalent of introducing negative rates and negative deposit rates in today's regime. So clearly, there can be an interaction with the way monetary policy is implemented, although this is not the main reason why CBDCs would be introduced.
Thank you very much. So I would also wanted to ask you what could be the major macro risks from the introduction of CBDCs? Like, are there macro risks? And if, which ones?
There could be some. We have spoken about disintermediation, and clearly if that were to lead to reduced credit growth, that would have macro implications. But let's assume that this is somehow controlled by design and implementation strategies. There could be still other risks out there, cyber risk, privacy risk. These are all risks that need to be considered. The one that I think is more relevant to look from a macro perspective is that when all transactions will go through a central entity, being a central bank, however kind of articulated the implementation might be, for example, with commercial banks issuing wallets and managing the day-to-day transactions, yet you would have created potentially a single point of failure, also from a cyber risk point of view, that clearly makes it extremely vulnerable. If you were to attack and that attack were to be successful, potentially you can have catastrophic repercussions for the financial system and therefore for the wider economy, which is the reason why it will probably design in a way the entire architecture to avoid to have single points of failure. The same way internet is conceived, there will be some elements of decentralization so that even if one of these nodes in this network collapses, all the network remains in place. Clearly, there are lots of design issues to be answered, but that's the work that is going to be done in the next few weeks, months, and years by the central banks.
I'm glad that you mentioned the internet, Brunello, and then I let you go because I always want to keep this interviews very short because we want people to listen and understand, and then we know that we can't pretend to have so much concentration for too long. But you touched the internet, and the internet maybe could be a good example. You know, when people ask me, why are you obsessed with this? So no, it's not that I'm obsessed with this, but we have seen how technological development has changed our life, and probably, you know, the people who took the decisions to move to this world weren't able to imagine what the world is today. Or this is my wrong perspective. Like, what's you've seen the world before the internet. I can't remember it.
I'm that old, unfortunately, yes.
So do you see any comparison of like what the internet was before and what all of this digitalization of money is going to be in the future? Or probably I'm wrong. I don't know. I just ask your opinion. That's much more valuable than mine.
No, thank you. No, well, I've seen the world without almost anything digital, without personal computers, effectively, without mobile phones, let alone without the internet. It was a different world, but things have evolved over the last 30 years. As I said, 30 years ago, you would go on holiday, you would send a postcard. Today, nobody would do that anymore. You send pictures via mobile phones. You used to write letters. Now you send emails. You used to do phone calls from your landline, and nowadays you have video calls from your mobile phone. All these things did not exist and now exist. And so in a world that has become fully digitalized, also central banks will need to adapt themselves and introduce an instrument that would also be digital. It's just a natural, I would say, evolution of the system. What people need to understand is that ex-ante is very hard to say how the world will evolve after this is introduced. A platform needs to be made available, and then applications or use cases, the way they are called, will come, because ex-ante, nobody could ever imagine that it's hard to go out every day without your mobile phone, with all your apps where you control all the aspects of your life. But this is what it is. Years ago, of course, you would simply go out. You wouldn't think about bringing with you your landline. So it's a totally different world. It's an open space. A platform needs to be provided. The same way you have a smartphone, eventually the apps will come. This is the same thing. You need to create the infrastructure, and then the use cases will follow for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, feel free to say I can't answer, but can we wait for a decade before we have this? Or we need to push it through a little bit sooner?
No, this will happen much sooner. There's international competition on that. China has already issued its own easy and wide, and the Chinese wallet can be downloaded in any smartphone if you want already today. So the Western world cannot simply sit and wait to see what the evolution is like. We need to catch up. We need to catch up pretty fast. I think it's a question of 2, 3, maximum 5 years. It's not a question of 10 years. The events of those days, including the war and so on, show how quickly this evolution needs to happen, and I'm sure we will eventually catch up.
Excellent. Well, Brunello, I just wish to thank you very much for being with us today and explain clearly to all our membership what is the real macroeconomic case behind CBDC. You touch on many points, and maybe we will do a catch up in a few months to see where we are and if things have evolved in the right direction. So for now, just thank you very much. Thank you.